All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I want to wish everyone a very pleasant good morning to you all, wherever you may be. I'm Julie Arthur. I'm the CASH Chair and Executive Director of Facilities and Planning for Palm Springs Unified School District. I hope that you and your families are safe and well during the COVID-19 pandemic. CASH has been providing you with weekly webinars to ensure that we serve our members with the latest and best information to help school districts and county offices of education as we look to return as students and teachers to our schools very soon. Last week, CASH's webinar discussed school schedules, class size, and social distancing, and other issues addressing public health security fears. Great information was shared as we start the process of reimagining how schools and the classrooms will function when school reopens. Tons of discussion via chat, lots of good comments and information. So for recording and the answers prepared from the questions asked during the webinar, please visit our CASH website. Click on the COVID-19 link to see this info and other links for COVID-19. Today is our 8th in our series of webinars, and it's titled Maintenance and Operations, Sanitizing, Disinfecting, Healthy Air, and Constant Monitoring. And on the screen with me right now, we've got Jeff Becker here this morning. Jeff is our CASH Vice Chair, and Fresno County Superintendent of Schools office pays his paycheck. Certainly CASH does it. He's going to tell us about the panelists this morning. Good morning, Jeff. How are you doing?
Good morning, Julie. I'm doing fine, thank you.
Great. How's things going in Fresno County?
Well, it's never a boring day in Fresno County. We're continuing to dig into our reopening plans. We had yesterday released our County Superintendent of Schools guidance document that we're calling Assumptions and Considerations for Reopening of Schools, that we shared with our school districts to provide some context for them and try and keep us together with assumptions that we're basing our plans upon. We're also trying to get a variance to move into stage 2 of the governor's reopening plan in Fresno County. And so we received a new health order yesterday with some masking requirements that we're working through and digesting and trying to figure out how that impacts our staff and students. So that was scramble a bit yesterday to figure out what that means as we're working on our reopening plan. And just lots of discussions about, in my office, about students with special needs and how we perform some of the medical assistance that they need with enhanced PPE. So there's a lot going on here in Fresno County, a lot that we're thinking about. How about you in Palm Springs?
Well, our Riverside County also had applied, and because our rates are really starting to flatline here, so we're trying to go farther into stage 2. All the casinos are opening today, so woo, with all their new guidelines. So the tribes actually have their own timeline there as a sovereign nation. So those have opened up. We're actually seeing more restaurants. We're looking at outdoor patio areas to open up to try and resume some things. So again, guidelines, keeping face masks, it's not mandatory now, but it's a good suggestion for everyone. I know in our area, everyone's trying to adhere to it. And if you are in our district office, it is mandatory that you wear a face mask anywhere inside, unless you're in your office with your door shut. So we are trying to do the best we can with that and maintaining our workflow here. So I see us in Riverside County, they're really pushing to reopen and go farther into stage 2. So, hey, I did notice something in that fabulous CASH email sent yesterday on the 42nd Annual Conference on School Facilities. I noticed the workshop proposals are titled a little differently now.
Yeah, thanks for that lead in, Julie. Just I'll make some comments about the annual conference coming up in March in Palm Springs, in your neck of the woods. Yes, the planning committee is getting together later this month to finalize the criteria for proposals for educational sessions. And I think that's reflective and more descriptive of the breadth of what we offer workshop sessions, clinics, the mini workshops that we started this year. So, even in the midst of these times of planning to get back to school, we are already working hard on the conference for next year to make sure that we have a great one.
That will be exciting, very much so.
Yeah, it will certainly be good, and I'm hopeful we'll see everybody in person. That will certainly be nice. Why don't I cover, Julie, a little bit of housekeeping and then introduce our panelists. So we have a lot of material to cover today, a lot of good stuff. So side, everyone is muted currently, but we do want to hear your questions throughout the presentation. So you can use the chat box and make sure that you are chatting with all panelists and attendees so that everyone sees the questions. You can use the drop-down caret in the chat box to make sure that you're messaging that group. We are recording this webinar and are going to make it available for future viewing. We're trying to do this even quicker and get it posted on the CASH website so that these resources are available in a really timely fashion for all of our members. So now let me introduce our panelists, and we have quite a few today. So leading us off is going to be Joe Dixon. He is a past CASH chair and is with Dixon Smart Schoolhouse. We're also joined by Jose de la Mora from Long Beach Unified School District, who will talk to us about some of the fogging machines. We also have Rex Wang with Leaf Engineers to talk about our HVAC systems, and Ian Padilla with Murdoch, Walrath, and Holmes, and again, he'll join on the air quality discussion. And then we have Dave Walrath with Murdoch, Walrath, and Holmes, and Bob Canavan with Federal Management Strategies to talk about how we're going to pay for this. And then last but not least, batting cleanup, Letty Boggs with Colby is going to talk to us about FEMA funding. So Joe, why don't I turn it over to you and let you lead us through your thinking on best practices around health security.
Okay, Jeff. Sam, can you start my video? It says I can't do it because you blocked me. Thank you. Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Julie, and good morning, everybody. I want to start off with something I heard this morning, and I wanted you to use this lens as I speak this morning. And he said, it's a colleague of all of ours, and you would know who it is, most of you, but he said, once the batter is mixed, it's hard to change the mix. And so what I mean by that is, as we go through this, as I go through my presentation with you, it's just so important that the M&O folks are involved in the plan for reopening schools. And that's how I'm presenting this. That's the lens I have. That's the lens I'd like you to listen and come up with your own thoughts on how this is going to work as we reopen. I also personally, I don't like this term we're using called the new normal, because this isn't normal. So, and hopefully it's not going to be, but it's something we have to deal with now. Sam, can you go to the first slide, please? So you have to make an assessment, and we were talking about this before this began this morning. You have to make an assessment of every site. Every school is different. There's 10,000 schools in California. You know, how are folks going to come into the front offices? Are we going to do shielded spaces? Because I don't think you want to have lines going out the door. Are we going to limit the access? And perhaps you have to make an appointment. If you're a parent, you have to make an appointment. And then in restrooms, how can we make them hands-free? Most of us over the past 10, 15 years, we've been putting in a lot of our appliances as hands-free, from water closets to hand dryers to faucets. But it's something we need to take a look at. As far as classrooms go, hard to believe, but there's a lot of clutter in classrooms. So, you know, I mean, when we talk about a 960 square foot classroom, what's truly the usable space? So when you start doing, setting up desks and how many students you can get in there, you really need to know what the usable space is. And how are they laid out? You know, I mean, is it a 24 by 40 960? Is it a larger classroom? And then playgrounds, yeah, we've been getting a lot of advice from different folks. CDC yesterday or the day before, and it talks about restricting access to playgrounds. I'm not sure if that's going to be possible or probable. So we have to understand how we're going to make sure the playgrounds are safe and what's an allowable activity. Next slide, please. So there's three different ways to approach this as I'm seeing it now, and that's all the immediate actions. And most of the schools I've been to over the past 8 weeks, most of them have already been disinfected, and you know, they're still being accessed though by teachers and staff and others. So what does that mean? You're probably going to have to go in and disinfect it again. There should be some kind of accounting for who's coming back into the schools. And so the M&O folks, you need to know what that is. In the training not just for M&O staff, but for all staff has to take place. And the personal protective equipment, of course, has to be available as well. We need to make sure that all our systems are functioning, and you're going to hear more about that later. But that means if you've shut off your HVAC to save money, you know, you need to, just like during the summer, if you shut it off, you need to get folks back in there well ahead of when school resumes to make sure it works, and have somebody check every single system to make sure it's functioning correctly. Custodial schedules. So I always thought of a custodian as having two different tasks, that of janitor and that of caretaker, and really have always tried to make sure that the day custodians especially were more janitor than caretaker, because the cleaning of the school is, to use a term really popular now, is essential. It has to be clean. And so you need as many people cleaning the school as you can. And then that thing about the community and parents and students coming back to school and being confident that your school is clean. Sometimes it's just the curb appeal that makes people go, you know what, they did a great job. This district, this school, we feel good sending our kids back. And it might not sound important, but it's an important piece to what we do. It's making people feel good about coming back. Next slide, Sam. So schedules, and you probably, most of you have schedules. You have to be part of that batter, that mix already, so that you know that your schedule coincides or works with whatever's going on the education side. But make sure you have schedules for your day custodians as well. And then flexibility with job descriptions. So these are extraordinary times. Are you talking with your human resources department? Are you talking with CSEA? If it's so important to be disinfecting on a regular basis, maybe numerous times a day, touch points and other parts of your school, who's going to do that? Are teachers going to help do that? Office staff, are they going to help do that? Are grounds people going to be disinfecting play apparatus and other things on the outside, or maybe even on the inside if you need them to? And maintenance folks as well. Remember the difference between maintenance and operations. And maintenance are those people who are involved with repair, and operations are the scheduled folks, typically would be custodians and grounds. But can they all do what needs to be done to keep the school safe and clean, and make sure the kids and the parents and everybody is confident that that's happening? I think that's going to be a big issue going forward. And again, certificated staff, you know, we've been fighting this for years and years and years. Personal appliances in classrooms, and that was more on the energy side. Can we get rid of them? Well, there's also a lot of stuff stored in a classroom. As I said at the beginning, how big is the classroom? If it's a 960 square foot classroom, what's the usable space? And you want to maximize that. So you're going to need to really emphasize that when you go through the planning for your schools. So how many how many students can you get in a classroom with the social distancing? Some models I've seen indicate 44 square feet per student is going to be needed. And you also have to remember that the teachers are going to need some kind of walkway or area that they can operate in without coming in contact with the students. So it's a big deal. And, you know, we've been, like me, I've been in the business a long time, been in a lot of different classrooms, and clutter is a huge problem. And we need to really try to get that cleaned up, obviously. Next slide. So then those are all the immediate things. So going forward, you know, are we going to be having to modify classroom layouts? You know how it goes. You set it all up, you think you have it right, but things change. So how do you modify classrooms? The biggest part to all of this is to do the assessment ahead of time so you know what you have. Most of you probably, if you're in the M&O business, you know what you have. You know how many classrooms, you know the sizes of your classrooms. And typically, depending on the size of the district, you know what they look like. But you have to be nimble, you have to be flexible because things could change. And then cleaning touch points, you know, how are we going to do that? Are there going to be Purell stations? Who's going to do it? How often are you going to do it? And then there's certain horizontal surfaces, especially that are conducive to harboring virus. So can you identify those and do something to change that? And then clutter removal, we already talked about. So we need to be able to work on getting rid of the clutter throughout our classrooms. Going forward, Sam. So in restrooms, you're going to have to, somebody's going to have to monitor the access. You're going to have to limit the numbers. There's going to have to be a cleaning schedule. Remember we talked about schedules, and if anybody needs examples, we'll have plenty of examples. At the end here, I'm going to talk about what we're doing, what the cash maintenance network is doing to help all the districts out. Remember, every school and every situation isn't exactly the same. It's just guidelines and some ways to take care of what we need to do is what we're after. There's going to have to be some effort on every district's part because everything's going to be a little bit different. There's no like here one page fits all. So you know, if you have those guidelines, they should be specific enough for you to utilize to be able to come up with the plans for your schools. But these are the areas you're going to have to address that I'm talking about. What's the next slide, please? So going forward too, in planning facilities, you know, you can see even if there isn't a virus or a pandemic or whatever you want to call what we're going through now as the new normal, hands-free is going to become an even bigger issue. And that could be doorways, that could be gates, it could be a lot of different things. And how you lay out a site. You know, we've been doing the single point of entry for the last, 15 years. And maybe that's not the way that we have our school laid out going forward. I know there's still some security, but again, it comes down to that site assessment as well. And then the furniture and equipment. What furniture and equipment would be easy to clean, doesn't harbor germs or viruses, is still flexible so that we can meet the instructional needs, because we still do have to educate the kids, and we do have to educate the kids a little bit differently as we've been trying to do what we used to call next gen anyway. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is what I want to talk about, what we're doing with the cash maintenance network. And I don't know if yeah, Ian's on here too. So Ian, why don't you pop in and you can talk about this as well. We put together a really diverse group of folks, experts in a lot of different areas, to develop a handbook that will have the guidelines and tools we think every district will need. Again, we can't tell you, here's specifically what you need to do, but here's some ways you can do what you need to do. So that's really our purpose. And then Ian, are you on board? So you want to talk about, we put together a rather robust committee, and you've been doing all the hard work on this thing. So why don't you talk a little bit about the committee and the timeline?
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's good timing with this webinar. It's almost like they're connected. A lot of the issues that we'll be addressing in this document we'll be talking about today. Joe, I think, hits on a critical point, and that's one of the things we've discovered. A lot of the practitioners are saying when we got together, well, it's not really a lack of information out there. It's what is the relevant information and how do we use this within the context of schools. So we're really trying to make it a real practical document, you know, to make sure you have all kind of, we'll have all the references, CDC, examples from districts and county offices, all those things, but we want to make sure that, especially on the first run here, that it's something we can put 3 holes in and put in binders and use. Excuse me, I'm going to close my door. There's some dogs out here. Sorry about that. So yeah, it's and in terms of the timeline, we have a call with our committee early next week to review our outline and then to basically be putting meat on the bones. Obviously, we're balancing speed and content, but we know that speed is very important here. I see there's 250 people interested on the line today, and I know a lot of other folks. So basically, we're working as hard as we can to get that out. And once we have that, we will be distributing that very widely within CASH and other places as we think a reference. One other thing I'd mention is that we, Joe and I and others, are working with folks from at the federal level. We're doing the same thing, as well as talking to a lot of you folks. How are you experiencing it at the local level? And a lot of what we're doing is kind of coordinating between those two to have a document that everyone can use to kind of coordinate all the guidelines out there, because again, it's not that there maybe isn't enough, there's too many, and we're going to try to use our expertise to get the most out there so people can operationalize.
Great. I want to address a couple of comments on the chat if I could. First is Tim asks about standards and not just the issues and what are the best practices, in something about 44 square feet, which is what I mentioned. That's Joe math, and last meeting it was 45. The thing is, so what I did is I took a 960 square foot classroom, decided 60 foot. I'm not in a classroom. I'm just telling you how I'm thinking. I took 60 feet away because of casework in unusable space, and just drew 6 feet concentric circles, if you will. And it comes up to 40, it came up to me, and maybe I didn't round it right, to about 44 square feet. But I think the point is, Tim and everybody else, is we're putting this document together that the standards don't come from us. We're not medical people. We'll have best practices and we'll have references for everybody to be able to utilize. It's just too hard with, 10,000 schools in California, and I don't know what is there, I don't know how many classrooms, to come up with just one set standard, and the the age of the school, the equipment in the school, the restrooms, the access, all of that. That's why the very first thing, and hopefully has already been done, is you do a site assessment. You have to assess every site. From the moment kids come onto the site, from drop off, how's that going to look? Are we going to have different drop off points? What is your calendar going to look like for your district, for your school? And there's a lot of different models out there. Nobody's telling us from the state level, whether CDE, governor's office, or anywhere else, exactly what model we're going to use. And then I want to answer Jeff about keeping masks on kids and staff. Why do we need to social distance? Again, we're going by the recommendations that we get from CDC and CDE, and we're going to come up with the best practices based on what those folks are telling us we have to do. And so far, CDC, for example, didn't say this is what you have to do. They have guidelines too, but their guidelines are to social distance, 6 feet. And so it's going to be, following those, because we believe that most people, parents, staff, kids, are going to want us to follow that. And then counties will come out. County Office of Ed, Jeff Decker talked about the Fresno Superintendent of Schools came out with some documents on reopening. It'll be coming from counties as well. Our goal, as Ian pointed out too, is to provide all those resources to you. Not tell you this is how you have to do it, these are the standards, but to give you the tools so that if you come across, as you develop your plan, something that you need a little assistance with, it's going to be there. That's our goal. I hope that helps. Okay, with that, I don't see any other questions. So feel free to ask questions as we go through. We'll be monitoring this as well.
Joe, I have a question. This is Tom Duffy.
Hi, Tom.
Hey, when you were talking about cleaning out classrooms and you talked about the clutter and the like in preparation, are you aware of districts doing that at this point in time? Are they communicating with teachers and others that may have offices in schools to come back and do that now? Is that in process?
Yes, it is. There's a lot of cooperation as well. And I've talked to a couple of districts recently who said, the cooperation has been unbelievable. They haven't seen anything like, as far as, teachers cooperating. Custodians are helping them move some of the things out. They're coming up with areas, storage areas and things like that, because we're going to have a lot of extra furniture. So yes, it's the cooperation in my 35 years in the school business is about the best I've seen. I mean, everybody's working together really well.
And Joe, that's what I hear, and I've mentioned this, I think, in past webinars, that the level of cooperation, and not saying that's not in my job description. We're not hearing that. We're hearing people say this is a unusual time. This is a crisis. We need to move. We need to act. We need to be collegial. So anyway, thank you.
You bet. That's a good question. Okay. There's a lot of challenges, obviously, going forward. We're all working, as hard as we can, as smart as we can to do what we need to do. We know the kids are going to come back. They have to come back. And what that's going to look like is going to be a little bit different in other places. At some point, I'm sure it's all going to settle into, to some kind of format that everybody accepts. But we're not there yet, that's for sure. Okay, I want to introduce our next speaker, Jose De La Mora. Jose is the Director of Operations of Long Beach Unified, pretty big district. And they've been doing some pretty good work on disinfecting and sanitizing their classrooms. So let me turn it over to Jose.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Joe. Good morning once again from sunny Southern California. Hope all of you guys are doing well. I wanted to start off by explaining the difference between sanitizing and disinfecting. In recent weeks in meetings that I've been part of, I've heard the term sanitizing and disinfecting intertwined or associated with each other. So I just wanted to provide some clarification on that and make sure that we all know that what sanitizing and disinfecting is. Sanitizing is meant to reduce, not kill, the occurrence and growth of bacteria or viruses on a surface. Disinfecting a surface is to kill the microscopic organism or virus. With that being said, 9 weeks ago, we closed our schools in Long Beach. And the week prior to us closing, our custodial department was looking for ways to disinfect surfaces and high touch points, making it safe for our students and staff. Now, what we started off with was spray bottles and buckets with disinfectants diluted to the proper ratio. And what we found out is this was very tedious. This was a very tedious task and time consuming. Obviously, some essential duties had to go away or be given up. And in our case, we stopped vacuuming carpets and we stopped mopping floors. But of course, stopping that practice was not going to get us very far. Then we implemented the use of Hudson sprayers. With the Hudson sprayers, we were able to cover a lot more ground in a shorter period of time. But this was still not allowing us to hit or touch the essential duties, such as what I previously mentioned, the mopping of our floors or vacuuming or mopping, I'm sorry. So luckily, I was able to touch base with one of our vendors, and this was a couple of months prior or pre-COVID-19, where I had the opportunity to demo electrostatic sprayers. And in all honesty, I was impressed with the technology at the time, but I didn't see a need. We fast forward 2 months and wow, is there a need? With the electrostatic sprayers, we're able to cover a lot more ground in a shorter amount of time. And the benefit to using an electrostatic sprayer is that once the chemical or the disinfectant leaves the sprayer, it's electrostatically charged where it wraps around the surface. This eliminates the need for someone to physically spray all surfaces of an item. So if you spray and it's 2 feet away, you spray it 2 feet away and literally it just wraps around, coats the entire surface, and you let it dwell for the proper dwell time. We're actually letting it dry in place and ensuring that that surface is disinfected. We're able to cover a lot more ground. Like I said, per fill, we can cover 800 square feet in about 5 minutes time. We had the opportunity to demo this equipment prior to making our purchase. And we've had 3 confirmed cases or facilities that have had COVID-19 confirmed cases. And we dispatched our emergency response team. We put together an emergency response team. That's a couple of vans that are equipped with all the necessary PPE, disinfectants, and tools and equipment that our guys need to address those facilities. And what we found out is that we were able to cover a lot more space or square footage with the electrostatic sprayers. A great tool. We are currently investing, and I'm going to call it an investment, $250,000 in our district to get our custodial staff the necessary equipment that they need in order to provide a safe learning environment for our staff and students. We're also looking into purchasing cold foggers. Again, we had the opportunity to demo some of this equipment, and again, very impressed with the results. We were able to cover a classroom in under 2 minutes with the cold foggers. The cold fogger that we are purchasing is also equipped with the electrostatic charge, meaning that the fog wraps around the entire surface. Again, we were able to cover an entire classroom with this equipment in under 2 minutes time. And what I liked about this is that sometimes the teachers don't get a chance to clean out their workspaces. So this particular piece of equipment does not damage paper. And that was a great selling point for me. We also use this piece of equipment to address outdoor play areas and equipment. The manufacturer claims that you can spray an object up to 50 feet away. We haven't tried it. The furthest we've tried was anywhere from 10 to 15 feet for our lower grade playground equipment, again, with great success. The pricing for the cold foggers, they run about $2,500 a piece from the particular company that we're buying them from. And the pricing for the electrostatic sprayers are anywhere from $700 to $800, depending on your provider. All right, so there's our slide. In front of you, you have the particular sprayers that we're purchasing. They have a they come with a 4-hour battery life and 1-quart catch tank. Again, the electrostatic sprayer mechanism, you could turn it off and on, whether you want to activate the electrostatic, or you can use it both on and off. Comes with, this particular model comes with 3 spray nozzle, which was actually really interesting in comparison to other models that we looked at that only came with a single nozzle. So you can manipulate the nozzle and the size of the spray with the nozzle. It does come with a light also. Again, you can cover up to 800 square feet in 5 minutes, which is really a plus on my end, because what we want to do, or our intent, is for our custodians to be able to cover as much of their assignments without sacrificing any essential duties. Moving forward, we may have to alter schedules, but with this piece of equipment, you will be able to cover horizontal surfaces and high touch points. Next slide, please. What you see here is the cold fogger. This is the cold fogger that I'm talking about, or that I previously covered. There are 2 parts to it. It's the sprayer itself that weighs about 5 pounds, and the backpack unit that has a capacity of holding 2.2 gallons. These are both battery operated units, and you can cover about 50,000 square feet per charge. As you can see on the slide, the person or the applicator has to have full-on PPE. That is the only downside that I can see to this piece of equipment, because they have to wear respirators. In our case, and I'm sure most of you will experience this, if you want to equip some of your personnel with this type of sprayer or fogger, we have to put them through a fit for duty exam or a medical examination, ensuring that they are apt to be able to wear a respirator. Again, when using this particular unit, you have to wear a Tyvek suit, goggles, mask, or a respirator. But again, you're able to cover so much square footage in a short amount of time, and that's what we were looking for when we decided to purchase all this equipment. This piece of equipment that we have in front of us is going to be part of our emergency response van. And again, this van is the one that we use to respond to suspected and confirmed cases. Do we have any? I'm trying to access some of the questions. Will it set off the fire alarm? We actually haven't had any cases where the fire alarm has been set, but you do raise a great point. Depending on your smoke detectors, we've had the fire alarm set before while using pressure washers, and the steam that was created, that possibly played a factor because the steam was at a certain temperature. But we haven't had any cases where this piece of equipment has set off the fire alarms. Do we come back and wipe if you use a product without soap in it? Again, if you want to have the proper, if you're going for disinfecting, you have to have the proper dwell time. If the product that we're currently using has a 10-minute dwell time, so we let it dry in place. There is no residue, so there is no need for wiping. I know that certain products do leave behind a residue. One particular product that comes to mind is the aqua tabs that are used in the electrostatic sprayers, and that's the white unit. Yes, that one leaves a residue and would require wiping. So you would have to identify a disinfectant that does not leave a residue. Has this chemical been tested and approved for COVID-19? It all depends. I would recommend that chemicals, I'm not recommending this particular chemical for you guys to use, but I would definitely make sure that it's an EPA registered and approved chemical to combat SARS or COVID-19 to be exact. I demoed it and ordered the Clorox 360. Any other questions?
Jose, it's Tom Duffy again. Could you go back through what you just mentioned a few minutes ago about residue and wiping? From what I heard in both, when you talked about using both devices, that you talked about the need for it to basically wrap around and then to be there for a period of time. So I was not sure what really needed to be wiped at some point in time. Seems to me if wiping is required, that's going to be more time on task for the person, the custodian or whoever it may be that's applying it. And then it's going to mean more time that the classroom or whatever the space is not able to be used because of the dwell time even after that. Could you clarify that for me?
That is correct, Tom. Most disinfectants require a 10-minute dwell time. We actually let it dry in place, so there's no need for us to go back and wipe it. As I mentioned, depending on the disinfectant that you're currently using, that may require I know that the Clorox tabs, for a fact, required wiping because they do leave a residue. We started, when we demoed the equipment, that's what we used, and we found out that it left a residue. And we were kind of turned off by it for the same reason, that it was going to require extra man hours for us to go back and wipe down the surfaces that we disinfected. So the current chemical that we're using is not diluted to the proper ratio, is not leaving a residue.
Thank you, Jose. And one other question. You talked about the cost of the equipment itself. What about the material that is sprayed? Can you give us some sense how expensive is that for a district?
It all depends. Again, costs vary in disinfectants, and what we wanted to make sure that we did is that we went with a unit that was non-proprietary. The first unit that we demoed, it wasn't necessarily proprietary, but they recommended that you used it with their pure tabs. It's a Clorox, kind of like the same tabs that you use in your pool. And they have the bleachy smell, but you are kind of locked in a way to purchase their product. So what we went with, the units that we went with that you had on the screen, they say any disinfectant that's approved to be placed in or dispensed through an aerosol works. What we're currently paying for our disinfectant is $60, I believe right off the top of my head, it's $64 and some change for the disinfectants. And we currently have this product at all of our school sites. So we already own the disinfectants that we're going to be running through the units.
Thank you, Jose.
It says here that they've purchased, yes, the electrostatic sprayers also come in a backpack. It's the same company that provides the handheld sprayers. They do come in a backpack, and you can cover a lot more ground. The reason why I decided to go with not purchasing a backpack unit for our custodial team is that we have an aging custodial team. And anytime we implement change, we see IAs and you guys can imagine. So we decided to purchase the handheld units, weighed about right under 5 pounds. So we thought it was the best for our district. Any other questions?
All right. Jose, thank you. That was fabulous. A lot of science out there that we really need to do to make sure that our schools are, disinfected on that. All right, let's jump into the next one. We've got healthy ventilation, HVAC units, economizers and filters. We've got Rex Wang and EMPD up. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello, Julie. Hello, Rex. Can everyone hear me?
All right, I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Well, excellent. Thank you, everybody. So what we're going to do, Rex and I are kind of tag teaming this one. I'm kind of the setup man, and what I'm going to do is give you a little bit about kind of the issue of indoor air quality from a kind of a policy perspective, and then Rex is going to jump into some of the details. But I wanted to, before I did that, follow up a little bit on what Joe Dixon was saying about the Cash Maintenance Network developing this guidebook for all of these issues that we're talking about in the next couple of hours. The one about cleaning and disinfecting, we are very deep into, and we need to continue to do that. But the issue of indoor air quality, HVAC, ventilation, and so on has also become part of the mix, and even long-term may be one of the more sustainable pieces of this whole effort. So that's one of the reasons that we are giving more attention to it. We'll continue to do so, and this will also be a big part of that guidebook effort. We have a lot of experts. Rex Wang is one of them, Roger Silvera, Chris Roosh from NEEM. Also, you've seen them presenting in the last couple of 2 or 3 months, also at in Long Beach at our annual conference. So basically, indoor air quality has been an issue for schools for a while here. First of all, starting at the top, indoor air quality is linked to teaching, right? The healthier it is, the studies show that it raises academic performance. We know that, but it's an important piece, I think, to start with. The other piece is the relationship between energy efficiency and indoor air quality. One, as we've seen from some of our practitioners, those two are closely related, and a lot of the projects are interlinked. It's a ways to fund things, different ways to skin a cat, so to speak, and so they're related. They're also related in other ways, I think, because as we see the need to increase ventilation for the health aspects, that also costs money on the running side. So a lot of that is, you have to think balance there, something to think about going forward. Rex, others will probably get into it, but 4 basic parts of this process in terms of the HVAC and so on: the installation, the equipment, the maintenance, and the monitoring. That's kind of a 30,000-foot summary of the process, and so that's kind of where you need to look to start getting your arms around it. Did want to mention one piece. Late last year, the Sacramento Bee had an article, pretty extensive, well-written article about this whole issue, and got pretty deep into it, particularly for paper print. And I just wanted to leave you with one small quote on that. Air quality in classrooms silently undermining students' chances at success. So that gives you a sense of how significant this issue is going forward, and state leaders and other stakeholders are engaging more and more in this. Something important to understand, it's kind of a tale of 2 studies. In 2004, the California Air Resources Board released their study on indoor air quality in portables and older classrooms. And of course, what we all know is they found that M&O practices are critical, changing filters. A lot of the focus was on the thermal aspects of that piece. So we know something from that. Last year, also 2019, UC Davis did a study on this as well, except they aimed at new classrooms. They used Prop 39 projects. And so they had a defensible cohort of projects that they developed some information on. Lo and behold, they also found that M&O practices are very important. And so, and this study was also commissioned by the California Energy Commission. And so that leads me to my next point, the regulatory and legislative context. The primary oversight agencies, and there may be more, but right now are, of course, the Division of the State Architect, the California Energy Commission, and the Building Standards Commission, because they're the ones that implement the California Green Code. Title 24, and this commissioning, acceptance testing, that is part of that piece. As I close down here, of course, also CO2 monitoring equipment and monitoring is going to become a thing. They will become required, and it's all part of this effort to look at indoor air quality. Finally, last year, before COVID-19 kind of changed the game, Senator or Assemblyman O'Donnell introduced AB 2162 that was intended to deal with this issue, and we actually had our first stakeholders meeting. Actually, that was the last time I was in the state capitol. It closed down the following Monday, but some of the folks, Rex was there, Roger was there with some others, and working on this. So the bill was held, of course, but the continuation or the stakeholder discussion continues here and other places. And I'll end with maybe the one that's hanging out there most about this whole issue. What is the relationship between indoor air quality and COVID-19? That's the question. I'm not here to answer that, but as you see, more and more people are talking about that. The CEC has talked about it. The American Association of Pediatrics has referred to that. So it's going to become more and more of an issue. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rex, and I'll be anxious to see your presentation, Rex. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. First off, I'd like to thank everybody just coming on here, signing on, and listening to the amazing content that Cash has been putting out. This has just been very, very good, very useful, somewhere to turn for the districts, to get some information. So my name is Rex Wang with Leaf Engineers. I'm the director out of Ontario, and we're also a part of PDK Architects. We do work internally. We work together. Every project that PBK is on, not necessarily Leaf is on. However, we do support them in every aspect, including cash. And so this has just been amazing. So thank you guys. Sam, if you could, there we go. So I wanted to talk about HVAC units and kind of how we can move into getting the units started up for the coming school year. Part of my intent with this slide is to explain a little bit about the typical unit. Now, you guys, there's obviously professionals in the on the presentation here, but I just wanted to briefly go over it. So number one, that's the outside air. Well, outside air comes in through the fresh air intake. That's not necessarily the economizer. So I want to talk a little about that. Our units, for the most part, have economizers. Now, in discussions with Joe and discussions with Cash and all the other folks here, some of the economizers aren't necessarily working. Now, the districts have done what they needed to do. It's been difficult to maintain, certainly, but nonetheless, they do have, most of them have economizers. So you have a fresh air intake, it moves in. Number two would be your return air, which leaves the classroom. Two very important things here. The picture shown here is 100% economizer. What that means is the air moves out of the classroom, it gets pushed out of the unit. Number one, fresh air comes in and it goes straight into number four. Number four is called mixed air. Under a typical scenario, number two, which is your return air, would mix with your outside air, number one, and you would get it would mix with your outside air and you would get mixed air, which is in the section number four. That would move through your filter, which is kind of denoted by that blue box right there. And after that would be your heating and cooling sections. And then that would be supplied into the space by number five, supply air. It's pretty important that every single component of this unit operates properly. And that's where I'm kind of going to go with this whole presentation. Wanted to explain this. There are moving portions. So if you see where the fresh air path comes in and it goes to the mixed air, those are two dampers right there. Those are moving objects. Of course, mechanical things, they fail over time. And the older they get, they need to be maintained. Filters certainly need to be maintained. We talk about the heating section and the cooling section. Well, if you can kind of imagine a radiator on your car, those things can get clogged up. If they are clogged up, then whatever is in between the fin material is, you know, potentially going to be in the airstream and get shot right into the classroom. So that's something we need to consider. Then of course you have your fan and your motor. Well, those have to be obviously working properly. Your motor needs to, you know, has a lifespan. There's a belt on this particular unit that's being shown here. You know, the belt needs to be in good operating order. The pulleys, the bearings need to be greased, and so forth and so forth. Now, obviously, the fan itself can get dirty. It can acquire dust. That needs to get worked on. That dust will inhibit the performance of the fan. And so, you know, proper maintenance is just incredibly huge right now. And later on, there's a couple checklists that I've put together, and it's been used in a previous cash presentation. You know, it's available on the net from the LEAP website. But I do want to go over that in a little bit more detail in this presentation. We have a little bit more time. And so this is kind of where we're going here. So Sam, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So economizers, how they work. Well, the intent of the economizer is to bring in cooler air from the outside and to use that as a first stage of cooling. So if the outside air conditions are proper, potentially you could be 100% economizer, meaning you're not returning any of the air back to the space. You're only using outside air. That would be fantastic if that was the case, if we were able to use that all the time. Unfortunately, the units that we have on the roof are not designed for that. They're designed for about a maximum of, you know, 25 to 30% outside air. That's at design conditions. So for example, you know, let's use Palm Springs, for example. The design condition in Palm Springs, design day could be, you know, 98 degrees. So at 98 degrees outside air, we can only bring in 30%-ish of outside air and mix that with the return air to properly cool it and to properly meet the set points. There are a couple types of economizers. There's barometric and there's power exhaust. Barometric is what's typically used at schools, and so that's kind of what this focus is about. You know, with kind of where we're going with this and indoor air quality, power exhaust might be the better option. Essentially, the difference is barometric uses the supply fan to push the air out of the space, we'll call it the classroom. Power exhaust has an exhaust fan attached to it. So during economizer, the power exhaust would kick on. Your supply fan would supply air down to the space, and then your power exhaust would essentially suck the air out of the space. For barometric, you're only dependent on the supply fan. And so the power basically works a little bit better. Nonetheless, as designed, systems are great and they work great. So common malfunctions, certainly debris is a big problem. You know, we have movement of air, and so dust, debris, leaves, and so forth. Dampers are moving. They have actuators. They are mechanical in nature, and they will fail over time. Period. That's just how these things work. So they need to be maintained. Power exhaust fan. Obviously, if you have another fan in your system, it's another piece of mechanical equipment. It's, you know, it very well could fail, and over time, like I said, it's a mechanical piece of equipment. It will fail over time, so it needs to be maintained. So what is the purpose of economizers besides just bringing in temperature control? So that brings us to demand control ventilation, and so demand control ventilation from the school's perspective and districts and so forth has really kind of come down to CO2. Can we lower the CO2 levels in a classroom? And the answer is absolutely we can. Of course, we can do occupancy schedules, we can do occupancy sensors and so forth, and play with the ventilation based on the amount of occupants in the space and so forth. But like I said, it's really just a CO2 discussion right now. So Roger Silvera's district up in Northern California has been able to use Prop 39 funds and upgrade their HVAC controls. What they did was they took down, I guess, the dated control system, and they replaced it with a combination CO2 sensor and temperature sensor. So it's just a T-stat that's on the wall. That's very common to every zone, every classroom, and it can read CO2. It can also tell the unit, hey, my CO2 level is getting a little bit too high. We need to start modulating your economizer open so we can bring in more fresh air. Every article that I've read about CO2, I'm sorry, every article I've read about viruses and the COVID situation we have now is we can't necessarily just get rid of COVID. It's not really possible, right? It's a numbers game. It's a percentage game. And what I mean by that is we can dilute the air with fresh air. And so the quantity of contaminants is less in the air, in the space. So that's really important. So if we increase demand control ventilation, if we use demand control ventilation to increase the outside air, we effectively dilute the contaminants. We lower the overall percentage of contaminants in the space. And that's a great thing. That's what we want to do. Before I jump to the next slide, I want to take just a real quick peek at these questions. So UVC lighting and the air handlers. Certainly UVC, Sam, could you go back a slide the other direction? I see some questions about air handlers and stuff. So if we were going to do UV lights in a space, or I'm sorry, in a unit, what they would essentially do is they do not treat the air. It's not the intent of it to treat the air that passes through the unit. The intent is to prevent growth on the coil. Now, cooling coils, by definition, as they work, they have condensate. Well, that condensate is moisture. Moisture likes to attract living things, and to get rid of those living things, one strategy is to use a UV light that shines in that section, and it basically prevents growth on the coils. Does it work? Absolutely. Is it safe? Yeah, absolutely safe. It's not safe if you're directly exposed to it. However, there's safety measures involved when you open the panel. There's little switches and stuff. So when you open the panel, it automatically shuts down the UV light, so you can get in there and service what you need to service. So absolutely does work. Can you retrofit it? Yes, absolutely. Is it kind of treating the air, which is kind of where a lot of our discussion has been going? No, it does not treat the air. That's not the intent of it. Of course, it will at some percentage, but that's not the intent of the technology that I've seen, at least. Let's see here. Ionic air scrubbers and the return air. So certainly there's other ways. We're going to get into air scrubbers in a second here. That question is from Nick. And then not all of our units have economizers. Is this something that we can be added to an older unit certainly not all units, and we understand that, which is why we're kind of having these discussions. Sam, if you go to the next slide over, we can just stay here for now. The units can almost always, is kind of the big key term here, almost be equipped with an economizer, so long as a unit had that option to begin with, right? What we have seen is furnace style, residential style furnaces, where you have a furnace that's inside of a closet in the space. It has a filter similar to your house. The air goes in the bottom of the furnace, comes out of the top. There's a cooling coil on the top, and then that cooling coil is piped to a condensing unit outdoor. Again, similar to a classroom. In that case, can you install an economizer? That's going to be pretty difficult. And in fact, it would have to be a custom application. So the unit is not originally designed for an economizer, so it's going to be hard. If the unit is designed for an economizer and it doesn't have one, it's fairly straightforward. It's fairly simple. It doesn't cost very much. We're not in the thousands of dollars, for that type of stuff, at least for equipment cost. And yes, absolutely, it's possible. Is it feasible? Again, absolutely. However, I think the question is more along the lines of the furnace style fan coil units, residential style fan coil units. Is it possible there? No, not necessarily. And so what we have to do is make sure that we maintain what we do have properly. And I would even go an extra mile, which I'll get to in my slides here. Sam, if we can go one more. So I want to talk about filters, and I'll talk about kind of the maintenance things and the things that I would be looking for as an engineer. My experience comes from general contracting, from designing, design build, and then I was a commissioning agent for a while, back in design now. So I've kind of seen quite a bit of things, and that's where those checklists come from. Filters. So MERV 8 has a 30 to 35% efficiency. Nearly every single filter that we're using these days, and I say nearly because I can't speak to every single one, is going to be MERV 8. 2019 code minimum, which took place when effective January 1st of 2020, now has MERV 13. You can see that the efficiency is significantly greater. What's interesting about this change from 8 to 13 is that for the most part, you can buy a MERV 13 filter and put it into a MERV 8 application. So if the unit was originally designed for MERV 8, we can just buy the better filter and stick it right in. We'll get a lot more efficiency out of it. Not really a big deal. From a fan power perspective, most fans can handle the additional pressure drop from 8 to 13, no problem. Not an issue. I think this is probably a good idea. However, if our units are dated, they're in the 18-year service life, service life of 20 years, and we're at 18, 19 years. Dare I say they're at 35 years in a 20-year service life. Well, we might have problems then. If your fan is not properly maintained, if it's dirty, if the motor is dated, not operating properly, then we, any additional stress to the unit would be a problem. So that's something to think about when we try to implement something like this. So moving over to HEPA, and this will play into my next thing here. So HEPA filters are by far kind of the cream of the crop. They can do 99.97 efficiency of particles at 0.3 micron. 0.3 micron is very small. I think the average virus size is 0.125 micron, right? So it's interesting here, and I hope I got that data right, but I did pull it from Wikipedia. The intent of us filtering air and filtering viruses out of the air isn't necessarily to capture the virus by itself. Viruses are the smallest things that we deal with, and usually. I'm just going to kind of speak high level. I'm not an expert here in viruses, but viruses cling to other things. Talking about if we're sneezing, the fluids that leave our body when we sneeze, viruses are in that fluid. Well, that fluid is not the same diameter of the virus. Same for dust. Same for smog, for example. Same for kind of everything. So these viruses, the bacteria, and the really, really small stuff that we can't necessarily filter out, they like to cling to other things. Static charge is probably the number one thing of why they cling. Well, if we can filter out the dust, if we can filter out the fluid particles, that's a great thing, because that means the viruses and the bacteria that are stuck to it are going to be filtered out as well, and they'll stay at the filter. So going back to HEPA, it is the best. That's the best technology that we have out there from a filter perspective. It's not used throughout the hospital, but it is used in the operating rooms and sensitive spaces. So, if we want to say, are we using hospital grade filtering in our schools? Well, if we go to MERV 13, then yes, absolutely, we're using hospital grade. Hospital in the common areas, in the waiting rooms in hospitals have to be 100% exhausted. It's a little bit different of a scenario. Nonetheless, from a filtering perspective, we can say that. So that's great. Can we add filters to units or to zones and classrooms that basically can't handle the additional pressure drop? Yes, is the answer. We can add filter boxes. If there's no slot for the filter, we can add a filter box in the ductwork. Pretty straightforward. You know, for any kind of mechanical contractor, it's very straightforward. They can just cut into the supply or the return. In this case, I would like to use it as a final filter. If you do it as a pre-filter going into the return, well, then all your outside air contaminants don't pass through that filter. So, you know, if we're going to add something, add it as a final filter. So as soon as it leaves the space, all the air coming into the space passes through that final filter, and we achieve what we're trying to do here. We can add a filter box. If we want to increase the pressure drop, increase the filter efficiencies, even say let's go HEPA. Well, the units will not be able to do HEPA as of right now. It's just HEPA needs to be designed for, right? And if the unit wasn't originally designed for HEPA, we won't be able to do that. What we can do is instead of adding a filter box, it'd be a fan-powered filter box. Is that right for everything that we're trying to do, every classroom, you know, in every school? No, I really don't think so. However, if there are spaces, if there's special spaces in a class or special spaces on a campus, you know, say that there's an adaptive program in a particular wing of a school, you know, and they may have compromised immune systems, something to that nature, then yeah, absolutely, on a onesie twosie special case, we absolutely could do a fan-powered filter box, and it would be not really that much of an impact. The scary numbers start when you start to multiply and you know, start looking at every single classroom, start looking at just the numbers just get astronomical, and you know, we're sensitive to that, but not necessarily need that. And again, like I said, hospitals don't even do that. So something to think about there. I'm looking at some questions here. MERV 13 submission for day class generates a lot of dust. Is it necessary to disinfect the filter while moving? So we're looking at basically one of the questions is it necessary to disinfect your filter while removing? I would probably say not necessarily. I mean, we certainly need to be careful. We need to have our proper PPE for the maintenance staff to go in there and service and remove filters and stuff. That's going to go in the trash anyhow. So, you know, we're not going to disinfect basically our trash, right? So that's not necessarily gonna be needed. However, I will say this: I had a lot of experience in the healthcare industry before I came to Leaf, and it's interesting because I've had to be on a roof where I was surveying, you know, lab exhaust fans, for example. Well, lab exhaust fans are the absolute worst stuff that a hospital deals with. You're talking the worst stuff. You know, all the infectious diseases, all that stuff goes through the lab exhaust system and shot out the roof. Of course, there's special criteria for that exhaust fan. They run at a very high static. For example, they have to discharge a certain distance off of the roof line. There's a certain exit velocity that they have to discharge at to increase, to guarantee the plume and get it into the atmosphere. But nonetheless, the stuff that's in that fume hood, it's going right out of the roof. So, you know, it's really no different. Fresh air is still the best idea, that, you know, the best solution that we can do. And, you know, if we're not careful, we could get infected. But nonetheless, even at hospitals, even at labs, the lab exhaust gets scrubbed and it gets shot right out of the top of the roof. So fresh air is still better. Still the answer, fresh air. We have a grant program. So there was a comment here. We have a grant program through our air district for filters, but the program only allows HEPA filters. Is there a resource I can use to evaluate and see if we can use these statewide or site-wide? So absolutely, you know, it kind of based on, number one, as-built. So as-built are kind of difficult to go by, and frankly, I don't really trust as-built. We do our best with as-built. However, I want to go to the unit. I want to put my eyes on the unit. I want to look at the nameplate that's on there, right? That nameplate will give us the serial number at worst case scenario, we get a serial number, we call the vendor, and we find out what the performance of the unit is. We will need to look at maintenance records with the district, make sure that unit is operating properly, has been maintained properly. And then again, also the checklist that I get to next are gonna go over that. But, you know, a lot can be said by just looking at a unit. Just like when you're buying a used car, right? If you have a car that's a little bit beat up, if the paint's a little beat up, if the interior is a little beat up, what else have they neglected? Well, it's kind of unfortunately the same thing for these units. A lot can be said visually, but nonetheless, records are very important. All right, so if we can go to the next slide, Sam, please. So here we have some checklists that are pretty important in my perspective. However, these are high level, and I think if we treat them high level, we're gonna be doing okay. I don't want to do the controls yet. I'll talk about the air conditioning unit first. So we'll just briefly run through each item and why it's there. Does the main fan operate properly? So we're gonna know pretty quickly that if the main fan is not working properly, it's gonna be making noise. It's gonna have a lot of dust collection on it. Bearings are going to be dry, you know, so forth and so forth. So does it operate properly? It's kind of a yes or no question. It's either going to be working the way it seems like it should be, or it's not. If it's not, it will be obvious to the person that's taking a look at it. Next, condensing coils. Are those in good condition? So condensing coils is not necessarily a indoor air quality from a contaminant level perspective, but it's very important in temperature control and humidity control. Condensing coils are what reject the heat from a unit. So if those coils are dated, aged, weathered, a lot of times, you know, if you see like a window unit, you can see the fins. People like, you know, kids will like write their names in the fins. That's the condensing unit, and that's the condensing coil, and those need to be properly maintained as well. The compressor, same thing. You know, I think we've all been in classrooms or portable buildings where the unit kicked on and it felt like somebody was outside and just banged on the wall. What that is the compressor is kicking on, and the bushings are probably the vibration isolation is probably worn. So as the compressor kicks on, it's banging around in there. That's something that needs to be maintained. Same thing, condenser fan. So the fan for the condenser is what pulls air across the condenser fins. So if that's not operating properly, then you know, noise is a number one component for condenser fans. But also, you know, it will inhibit the efficiency of the unit. So controls at the unit. How do we look at controls at the unit? Well, we're going to have to pull off the panel, take a look at it, and just visually see, are the wires not frayed? Are they all in good standing condition? Are all the wires also torqued properly? Torqued is kind of a, I don't know, I think it's overuse of the term because it's really just a tiny little screw. So torque is more like an electrical term. But we get into economizer here, fourth from the bottom. So does the economizer look right? There's typically a filter section as the air comes in. You know, that filter needs to be looked at, right? That's pretty obvious there. However, when we look at the dampers, we have to make sure that the dampers are operating properly. It's going to be pretty obvious. You'll have dampers that are straight and they might move together. But if the damper's broken, you'll have one fin that's just kind of sticking off to the side, and then the others will move. Well, that's a big problem, right? Because you're getting leak by and so forth. So we need to make sure that those are operating properly. Electrical disconnect. There's usually a little panel. Little meaning could be like about an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper size, and there's a disconnect on it. That disconnect has to be working properly. You got to be able to turn it off, lock out, tag out, and then work on the unit. So if that disconnect is not working properly, how can they properly maintain the unit? So, you know, we get into everything about the unit and all of the maintenance. Filter. So filter is pretty important. I mean, that's for obvious reasons. Filters go in at a certain direction. They are directional. There's usually an arrow that's stated on, that's printed on the filter. So we have to make sure that those are in there properly. if you put the filter in backwards, the unit could blow the filter out, and basically it'll just fall apart and go into your airstream. So it's not good. But filters need to be up to date. It's pretty hard to get to stay up on filters, especially with the amount of units that a district has. But nonetheless, that's an easy one that which I think everybody can kind of agree to. Also, if we're changing filters constantly, then it would make every sense to have the technician, while he's changing filters, which is probably the guy that sees the units the most, do a quick checklist. If I'm already there, just do the quick checklist, right? It's useful. You already have the technician there. The important part that we have here is, I had a coach back in high school, this brings me back, but he said, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. So if we're sending, let's say we're understaffed and we need to send a new guy up there, is that guy gonna know what he's looking at, or is he just gonna be checking boxes? So we have to properly train our guys. So this is just an example. Maybe we can do a refresher course before we start the summer maintenance program. It could be an hour, it could be 2 hours, just to run through the units and to get everybody acclimated again, and then give them some points of interest that they should look at every single unit. For example, just how does the thing look, right? And then that's also the last item here. What's the overall exterior appearance, right? Does it look okay? They can be rusted. It's all right. That happens. However, what are the internals looking like, right? Does the motor operate properly? Are all the bearings greased, like I was mentioning earlier? A lot of that information is pretty important. For a lot of our districts, with the units sitting on the roof, the nameplate is just getting beat down by the sun. So if that nameplate looks like it's not working properly, or I should say, it doesn't look like it's going to survive another season, well, maybe we should just take a picture of it, or we can just jot down some info on the checklist that they're doing for that particular unit. Jot down the serial number is kind of the most important thing. Just write it down on the piece of paper. So now there's a record that if we go to that unit, we can't get the serial number because the label is just completely weathered, but at least we have records of it. Can't tell you how many times I've been on the roof where there's just absolutely no record of the type of unit that's up there. We have, it looks like a carrier. It's probably a carrier. And then we call the vendor, yeah, it's a carrier, but I have no idea what it is. Well, that would help us, and also help the district to buy replacement parts. If replacing the unit wasn't really feasible at that time, then we would need to buy parts for it. So we go over to controls. Pretty important here. Overall appearance of the T-stat. Well, what I see a lot are T-stats that are covered up by by artwork. That T-stat cannot get covered by artwork, can be covered by casework and so forth and so forth. It's pretty important. That's what tells the unit how to work. And so we get into a little bit more of commissioning here. So when you place the unit into heating, so you put the unit in heating and you change the temperature set point to make it want to go in heating, right? Does heat turn on? It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but it does take time, and it does take an extra step, right? Same thing for cooling. Increase the cooling temperature or the cooling set point. Does the unit go into cooling? Does it provide cooling? The next would be CO2 levels and the DCV. DCV is demand control ventilation, like we talked about earlier. So as the CO2 levels increase, the demand control ventilation is supposed to take over and increase the amount of outside air. So now we can't obviously just increase the CO2 levels in the space locally. That's not really feasible. But we can change the DCV set points. So you change the set point, and then we go into we should be able to verify if the economizer is opening, and what that means is opening to bring in more outside air. So we might need to have a two-man crew, one on the roof, one inside the space, or nonetheless, you can do all the rooms in that building. Say if we have 5 classrooms in that building or 6 classrooms, you can go to all 6, set the DCV set points to very, very low, you know, below 300 parts per million. Outside air is about 300. So if you set it to like 100, let's say, it would be beyond, and then run up on the roof and make sure that all the economizers are open, something like that, for example. And then we go to time, right? Schedule time. Does the unit turn on, turn off at its scheduled time? Very important here, because we want to, one of the ideas, one of the strategies that I'll get to in a second also, next slide, would be that we can purge our spaces. So we can do a morning purge, and all that really means is that we turn the unit on. Units have a minimum outside air set point that they have to meet no matter what. And so if the fan is running, we're bringing in outside air. Very important. So if we turn on the unit, say an hour, 2 hours before the occupants get there, then we have an opportunity to dilute and you know, rid some of the contaminants inside the space. Another option, I was talking to some of the architects yesterday, was we don't necessarily have to wait until the morning time to do a purge. If the occupants are leaving at 5, we can run the unit until 7, and so we adjust the schedule so it runs 2 hours after people leave and then 2 hours before people start. So we get effective 4 hours. I mean, worst case scenario, we can run it all night even. But the point is, we can purge while they're not there as soon as they leave, and then we can purge before they get in. So that's one thing that we can do. Practically every TSTAT can do that, and you know, we'd be all right there. So next is BMS front end. If your district has a BMS and has a front end that we can take a look at, a centralized BMS, then we can go there, and we want to make sure that the user interface is working properly. And the next item is the BMS panels, the actual panels themselves. Are they, what's the condition of those guys? It's pretty important. Again, want to open the panel, want to make sure all the wires are nice and neat, you know, and everything is torqued properly. And then the sub panels are basically the same thing. So in general, the control system is very electronic. However, there's hardware involved, and we need to make sure all the hardware is working properly. Next slide, please. All right. So this comes out of our building well paper, our building well white paper that we kind of threw together to help our districts understand the options that they had. I did not bring in the new facilities because I feel like this group here is more focused on existing facilities and trying to focus on how we can get ready for the next school year. And so I would like to focus basically on the basic cost, right? The single dollar sign as opposed to the triple dollar sign. So maintenance, number one, absolutely maintain. I can't stress that enough. And while we're maintaining, they need to be maintained properly, right? So we can't just send a technician up there. It has to be maintained properly. All the air filters, are the air filters up to date? A lot of times they are monthly. If they're not monthly, well, you know, no problem. If we're getting ready for the new school year, we're probably going to be starting with fresh air filters anyhow. So that's something to look at. And then cooling coils, drain pans, stuff like that. That's all very basic stuff that should be happening. But like I said, it might be a good idea to throw in some training right before you know, we set the guys out there. Low to medium would be economizers. We can start flushing out stuff, flushing out the spaces, demand control ventilation. We can override them and run 100% of the time. If the stat and BMS is, we'll say, advanced enough, options are there. During our purge, we can purge at 100% outside air. We don't have to run the purge at minimum outside air. And so obviously the 100% outside air would bring in the outdoor air conditions. So it gets very humid outside. You know, now we're going to have to deal with the humidity. I wouldn't say issue, but we'll have to deal with the humidity that gets brought in. If it's very dusty outside, well, it's really gonna start loading up our filters prematurely, right? Dusty in California would really attribute itself to wildfire ash. That's a big deal. If you're near an airport, you'll get the jet fuel exhaust. It's pretty, it's like soot almost. So pretty important there. We get into higher cost and retro commissioning. So the checklists that I have there are really derived from my commissioning experience, and so they are retro commissioning, for an example, and it's really good stuff. So if you guys can do it in house, that's fantastic. If it needs to be outsourced to be retro commissioned, that'd be fine as well. What I would say is a lot of commissioning agents will run through the steps, but they won't actually implement any changes, right? They'll advise changes. And so something to consider if you're bringing on a CXA, make sure that maybe that the implementation recommendations they get followed through on. So you don't end up spending money for a list that doesn't actually get implemented. Pretty important. In my opinion, I mean, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I think air conditioning is really important. I know that kind of sounds funny, but that's how I feel about it. And then obviously we have the ability, we have the technology that's out there to monitor air quality. Air quality contaminants would be obviously CO2, but it would also include just a plethora of other things. And so they can monitor practically anything right now. And it's just really about the cost and the ability of the units, ability of the equipment. So we can, that can provide real-time data, and it's important sometimes to have that. Other times it's scary to have that, but nonetheless, the technology is out there and it can do that. If the BMS is capable, that information from the air quality monitors can be put into the BMS. A sequence can be written, and we can increase or decrease or modulate the HVAC system as needed to try to get rid of those contaminants. See, we have another question. How effective are portable HEPA filter units? Well, portable HEPA filter units right now are definitely available. They can get costly, and that's why it's not necessarily a great option. I was talking to a vendor, and the portable units right now are really designed around healthcare and designed around filtering a individual patient room in a hospital. And so classrooms are much bigger, and so you would need at least 2 of these filter units. But they absolutely work. 100% absolutely work. They can get noisy because HEPA filters have a high pressure drop, and when the motor is, the fan is pushing that much air against the filter, and the filter's kind of holding back that air, well, it's gonna get loud. So absolutely, HEPA filters units are available and useful. Again, similar to the discussion I had earlier, probably only for special applications is where we would use those. Do filters catch COVID-19? Well, I would say if the COVID-19 virus, if the what is it, SARS-CoV-2, I think that's the name of it, is attached to dust and the filter catches the dust, absolutely it will. I'm not a expert in COVID-19, but nonetheless, the intent of even wearing masks and stuff is that it'll catch the bodily fluid that leaves our body just from breathing, and if the virus is in those water droplets from our breath, it's supposed to catch that. So it's very similar. Let's see here. So Joe, there's a question, or Joe had a question. It said, can't see how the virus gets to the filter or the UVC lamp on the return. So we're supposed to be 6 feet across, right? 6 feet away. The units are most definitely, 99% of the time on the roof. And so that's pulling fresh air. Well, we'll call fresh as fresh air. So, it's supposed to be the best air that we have. It's better than indoor air. There's plenty of articles out there that say outdoor air is better than indoor. So yeah. Do we have another slide here? Sam? Okay, so we're done there. But essentially, training, very important training, and then maintenance. We have to deal with what we have, and if the stuff that we have is working properly, we're going to be in a lot better shape. That's really where all this kind of goes. Are there additional things that we can do? Absolutely. Jose talked about that. With the fogger systems, that's not HVAC. However, the fogging systems can be used to disinfect the ductwork, and so there's things that we can do to disinfect. However, I would like to mention, it's once we disinfect, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be contaminant free. As soon as somebody moves into the space, as soon as something happens, somebody goes in, we have contaminants again. So it's an ongoing process. Let's see, I don't know if I see too many other items here.
Hey Rex, this is Julie. Did you answer
Yeah.
the question about not all units having economizers? Is it something that can be added to an older unit?
Right, yeah. So I did talk about that. So if the unit itself is designed to accept an economizer, very straightforward, purchase the economizer, we throw it on and then do a little bit of reprogramming, it should work fine. The difficult part is if they're more residential style and the units weren't designed as to accept an economizer, then in that case, it's a lot more difficult to basically install an economizer. What you can do is to add a supply fan, outdoor air supply fan. You can do a louver, a gravity vent to purge the outside air. All that stuff really needs to be designed properly, though. You can't just bring in outside air if you don't treat it properly. And by treating, I mean either heating, cooling, filtering. Palm Springs is a great example. If one of your buildings doesn't have it and you wanted to just bring in outside air, you can't bring in 115-degree outside air.
Right.
So it needs to be accounted for. It needs to be designed. It's not necessarily something that you can just bolt on.
Is there an age of the unit that would benefit from that if it was designed to accept it? And what would the ROI, as you kind of look at what your return on investment of putting that economizer in, and at what age would it not be, financially a good idea?
Right. So economizers don't, they don't cost that much. I want to say they're maybe a quarter, even less than a quarter, 15% of the cost of the unit, something in that area. It's not much, right? So the ROI is probably not really the intent of it. It's really the benefits that are there because they don't cost too much. Now, obviously, if we use it as a first stage of cooling, we get some energy savings there. But it's important that the benefits kind of outweigh the ROI, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. Sometimes it's not the ROI always. It is other benefits that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple more questions here, and I think Tom, do you want to jump in real quick? Do you have a question?
I just wanted to comment that this has been an excellent presentation, Rex, and really what it underscores is what a school district really needs to do to make sure that it secures from its general fund, therefore the action of its board, money to be able to maintain their HVAC systems. And of course, there's other systems that have to be maintained as well. But because of that impact on that Ian was talking about earlier on student learning, and also the research that talks about attendance at school, that when air quality in the classroom has increased and is optimal levels, students are in attendance, which means districts get the ADA, and they perform better, which is what we want. We want students in school and we want them to perform. Research says time on task, time in a seat is what yields the best for students, and that works if we have healthy environments. So I know we have to move on, Julie, but I just really wanted to underscore that because districts are going to have a struggle this year with adoption of budgets because of what everyone is fearing. We're going to hear from Dave, I know, in just a moment. But districts are going to have a struggle maintaining their RRMA funds. And in this presentation, I think, is what really underscores why those dollars are really needed. So thank you, Rex.
Yep, thanks, Tom. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Rex. We'll go ahead and then jump on to our next item, which is paying for school reentry, state funding, DOF May revisions, and federal aid to schools. And we've got Dave Walrath and Bob Canavan. Good morning, Dave and Bob. Oh, is it still morning? It's still morning.
Good morning, Julie. Thank you. It is still morning. Appreciate it. I hope my video is working. So, paying for schools. We all have seen the Department of Finance May revision. We've heard the economists discussing what can only be considered a cratering of the California and the United States economy, and that effect on schools and funding. So, going to, if you can move to the first slide. And then the second slide. So real quickly, from March till now and projected through the rest of next year, we're effectively over $17 billion in lower Proposition 98 minimum guarantee than we had thought we were going to be in January. So in a 3-month period, the economy started going down that fast and that hard. Next slide, please. So how are they filling the holes? For 1920, it's fairly straightforward. I call it, it's called a deferral, but you can call it an accounting gimmick. A little bit of the rainy day fund, a lot of one-time types of things, because we only have a little more time in this fiscal year. So those adjustments are being made. It's not a cut in the sense that the funds that would have been received at the end of June will be received 12 days later in July. Cash flow problem, but not something where the money is gone and you won't see it again. Most of the other cuts are money that hadn't gone out, hadn't been apportioned, hadn't been allocated. There were no commitments made. So it's fairly easy to sweep that kind of money. Next slide, please. Filling the hole for next year is a lot more difficult because it is so much bigger of a hole. I won't go reading through each one of these, but many of these are one-time actions, such as the federal funds that they're talking about are one-time federal funds. The federal funds allocation is such that it will not be allocated proportionally to every single school district. It will have a different allocation system. Not every single district will have the same per pupil. Also, there are expenditure restrictions. Most of them are tied to COVID expenditures and costs. Granted, those are fairly broadly defined, but nonetheless, it will be an accounting requirement, and I believe a later speaker will be going through this, on effectively using those funds to actually fill the hole. And then 50% cuts to categorical funds. Next slide, please. There is not a cut to special education, by the way. It is other categorical funds as identified. Anyway, from the legislative analysts, what they're attempting to say on this slide is when you count all the different actions of doing deferrals that get paid back, new federal funds, the lower Proposition 98 guarantee, effectively it looks like there is kind of flat funding. The reality is every district will be treated differently. Some will be in better shape given the allocations, given how the local control funding formula reductions are made, meaning if you are much more reliant on state funding, you will probably be in worse shape than if you are less reliant on state funding. Simply because the state can control the state money, but it cannot control local property tax. It cannot control the federal funds. Consequently, most of the reductions you will see will be to those state fund allocations. Next slide, please. So on this, in school facilities specific to the May revision, there is no change in the $1.5 billion proposed for 2021 to be apportioned as state match under Proposition 51. So for those of you who are looking at receiving those funds and then turning them around into another project, the May revision did not change that process. The administration did not propose any changes to the routine restricted maintenance account and the funding. It does continue the technical adjustment regarding the California State Teachers Retirement System employer contributions that are reduced because of state funding directly to CalSTRS. But that was in the current year as well, so it's a continuation of that. Then lastly, there is a proposal for greater flexibility in the use of school district site sale. Many school districts have not used this because it is difficult. We have not seen where the administration proposed a change to the NAILR Act. So it is possible you would still have to go through that process of first offering to other units of government and going through that whole process and dealing only with those properties declared through the 711 committee to be surplus. Quick update on the May revision. The budget will go through. The legislative analyst has a different take on this. Not trying to go through that. We will talk about that at another time on the legislative analyst take. And there's expectation that there will be a second review of this based upon your next presenter's comments regarding additional federal funds and what the actual state revenues look like after the July 15th payments. With that, I'll transition over to our next speaker, Bob Canavan, who is a well-respected, knowledgeable, and a great presenter on federal funds. Bob?
Thank you, David. And I do want to take a second to say thank you to Cash. I've been working for Cash and working with Cash, and want to thank Julie and Jeff and all of you. And I particularly want to thank the members of Cash who participate in Californians for School Facilities, working on advocating for school facilities for California at the federal level. We talked, last time I was with the group, we talked about the CARES Act, which has provided significant funding, not enough, never enough, but it is funding through school emergency relief funding for school districts. And right now, California school districts should be receiving $1.4 billion through this CARES Act program. This should be going to the school districts to the local level at this very point. One of the things I do want to point out is that this funding is available. There is no supplanting requirement with this legislation, and that these funds can be used to take the place of state and local funds. So they can be used to do backfilling where state funds are being not quite as available as they were previously. And in listening to the previous presentations today, many of these services that you were talking about today these funds can be used for the activities we're talking about, such as preparing these schools, addressing all of the services that we're talking about today, and hopefully some of these funds can be used and will be used for services we were talking about here today. But as David was saying, can there be more, and will there be more? And there are efforts being made. The House of Representatives has already taken action for another relief package. Speaker Pelosi, when I spoke with you all last time, we were talking about, or I suggested that the Speaker was going to move pretty quickly on another care pack, not a care package, but another. We were talking about whether or not there would be a CARES 2 bill. Well, she's calling it the HEROES Act, and the House has already passed the HEROES Act. They voted on it last Friday. This is the House Health and Economic Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, HEROES Act. This is a $3 trillion bill, which is providing aid to state, cities, and counties. There's over $1 trillion for aid to state, cities, and counties. Also included in this legislation is an additional $58 billion for K-12 education. Democratic leaders wanted to move this through quickly. One of the reasons is the last two relief packages that have been produced came together on the Senate side, and the House was involved in the negotiations, but they were working off Senate legislation. They decided the next piece that came together, they wanted to work from a House bill, and that is what this piece of legislation is. The HEROES Act passed last Friday, pretty much on a straight party line vote. 12 Democratic members voted against the legislation. The final vote was 208 to 199. One Republican member voted for it, but it was 208, 199. It passed last Friday. There's, as I said, $1.9 trillion that will be provided for states, cities, and counties. And there's funding, $58 billion for school districts. This piece of legislation is going to be the starting point for House and Senate negotiations with the administration. Now, the situation right now is that Senate leaders are saying we're not going to take it up right now. And the administration, their position is we're studying whether or not there will be additional aid for state and local governments. They haven't reached a firm position as of yet, but this particular bill, the HEROES Act, will be the starting point for the next piece of legislation. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I'm not going to run through everything that's in this particular, on this particular slide for the sake of time, but I've said over and over again, there's a lot of provisions in it. I've described the $1 trillion that's going to be there for states, cities, and counties. The way that breaks out, $500 billion of that would be going to states, $250 billion of that would be this year, and $250 billion would be coming next year in 2021. $375 billion would be split equally between municipalities and counties. $20 billion would be for territories. The District of Columbia, which did not receive an appropriate share of funding in the last bill, would receive $755 million. One of the things that the HEROES Act does, a provision in there, it allows for the use of funds to reduce state revenues. That is something that was not in the CARES Act. And that's a provision that could be significant given the situation you're facing in California with the potential reduction in the state budget and in the reduced revenues potentially that you're facing. Another provision, there's no specific, it does not specifically address school infrastructure by itself, but the flexibility allows for cleaning, sanitizing, disinfecting of facilities, all of the topics that we were talking about today. So all of the activities we're talking about today very definitely would be funded, could be funded under the HEROES Act, just as they can be funded, are allowable uses under the CARES Act itself, and all those funds that are in the pipeline right now to California school districts. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now, let's talk specifically about what kind of funding could be available under the HEROES Act for education. There's $58 billion that's identified for elementary and secondary education. The CARES Act had $30 billion for education. This is $58 billion for K-12 education, and plus an additional $4 billion for governors to support K-12 higher education and related activities. The distribution of the stabilization fund for the governors for K-12 and to local education agencies is distributed to the states based on a formula, 61% based on the share of the state population, very important for California, as well as the number of students that qualify as low-income students, basically under Title I. So that's how the formula would provide funding for the states. As the funding reaches and goes to the state, it's funded, 65% of that funding will be distributed directly to K-12 school districts based on the relative share of funding that the state, based on the Title I formula, let's say it this way. Something I would want to point out for both this legislation and for the CARES Act, even though the funding is distributed based on Title I formula, the funding does not have to be used for Title I. It's just the Title I formula that's used to distribute the funding. It does not have to be used for Title I. There's flexibility that allows the school district to determine how to use the funding. A couple of other provisions that are pretty significant related to this. There's some controversy in terms of how the CARES Act funding is being used, with the Secretary of Education allowing some flexibility on her own part to create micro-grant programs which would allow students to use funding under this program, student families to purchase services from private providers, and potentially to use state fiscal stabilization funding intended for public schools to go to private schools. So the Secretary of Education is trying to direct some of these funds to go to private schools, and she's doing that under the CARES Act. Under the HEROES Act, there's a prohibition, or not specifically a prohibition, but there's stronger language to prevent her from being able to do that. And that's a pretty significant change. Other pieces that are included in the HEROES Act is an additional $1.5 billion for the E-rate program, which would strengthen the ability to strengthen the amount of money that would be available for the E-rate program, and which also would allow purchasing of hotspots, devices, and equipment. Obviously, this would be extremely important, particularly in communities where there are still gaps in terms of broadband. So that's additional funding under the HEROES Act. There's additional funding also at the Department of Agriculture for the SNAP program, an additional $10 billion for SNAP, and an additional $3 billion for the Child Nutrition Program. And this is particularly important because obviously so many school districts are delivering more meals than they had been doing previously because of the incredible need, because obviously brought on by this crisis that we're in right now. So there's some recognition of that under the HEROES Act that just recently passed the House. At HHS also, there's additional funding under the Child Care Development Block Grant, additional $7 billion. Could we have the next slide, please, also, please? Now, So to translate this into how much additional money could be coming to California under the HEROES Act, on the amount on this on the for to the of the 12 of the one I'm having a hard time getting this out, of the $1 trillion in state and local aid coming, California would be receiving $21.5 billion in the first year, and in the second year, which would be next year, $26.5 billion, a total of $48 billion. Now, this is all obviously still subject to passage and final legislation, but this actually is in the bill that did pass the House of Representatives this last week. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, this slide tells us how much money would actually be coming to education, K-12 education. And under this slide, California would be receiving, local LEAs would be receiving $10.7 billion, which basically is about 12% of what the national total is. So translating the total of $12 billion, the total grant to California of $10 billion, LEAs would be receiving $6.9 billion. LEAs would be receiving $6.9 billion. State of California would be receiving $10.7 billion. So that's a significant amount of money that would be added to the money the state is already receiving under the CARES Act. So this is the HEROES Act. Where we stand with that right now, it has passed the House of Representatives. There is very definitely a likelihood that this will result in additional legislation. What we're probably going to see over the month of June will be some pretty serious negotiations as the Senate develops some variation of a package itself, and negotiations, very direct negotiations between the House and Senate as to what the final package will be. But the very positive aspect of this is the starting point will be the HEROES Act, which has already passed the House of Representatives. The administration is saying we're not sure where we're going to be on this. At one point, the president said he would veto the HEROES Act, but there will be some significant pressure in June, we think, and we're pretty certain of that the administration will come around and say, okay, we're going to do something here. Something additional has to be done, particularly when he takes a look at all the shortfalls that are taking place in virtually every state across the country. So the HEROES Act is a very positive step, and I think we can thank the members of Congress who supported it, who voted for it, particularly the Speaker of the House who provided the leadership to put it together. And in terms of the California delegation, the Democratic members all voted for it. And I want to come back to where I started, which when I talked about California's school facilities, it's critical to let the members of the California delegation know what is happening at the local level, what activities are taking place to continue to deliver education services to students, but what steps you're taking and have to be taken to open up schools. The conversation we're having here today, just the preparation of the school facilities to welcome students back, but also the costs that are going to be entailed and how there has to be further federal support. So that's the situation in terms of where things are in Washington. And we're hopeful that the HEROES Act will move forward and that we're going to see additional federal funding to come along to help school districts across the state and to supplement the money that's already in the pipeline. So I'll stop right here and turn it over to our next presenter, and we'll move forward, and I'll respond to any questions at the end. because there's been no storm and I'm still here. So thank you very much.
That's great, Bob. Thank you so much. Lots of information. Okay, we've got Letty Boggs from Colby up next. She's going to talk about the FEMA and other federal funding sources, accounting for expenditures. Letty, good afternoon.
Hello. Apparently I'm standing between you and lunch, so let's move through this. We wanted to really give you a heads up on some things you need to be thinking about now as we're going into this effort of taking in the federal money, and what does the accounting for that look like. Go ahead, Sam. I also wanted to mention, because we had a question earlier, how are you all acquiring these things without going to bid? Under emergency orders, there is some relaxation and modification of bidding requirements, but you certainly should check with your legal and make sure you're okay on the bidding aspects of it. But there is a much relaxed ability to acquire if you can validate that you don't have time to do a regular process. So be aware of that and make sure you check with your legal before you just blow off all bidding requirements, right? So we have two kinds of federal funding at this point. We have the CARES Act and we have FEMA. So I kind of wanted to go through the two and compare them for you. The CARES Act is, as Bob said, based on Title I formula, but you don't have to spend it that way. That's just how they allocated it out. And while CARES Act can supplant, FEMA cannot. So we want to be really clear on what we're doing with each type of money. The CARES Act can cover 100% of your eligible expenditures up to the amount that you receive. So you want to prioritize things that can be bought so they get covered at 100%. The CARES Act is administered by the Department of Education, and I've given you a couple of links. Both of these links have really good information, FAQs, lists of things you need to know so that you can get familiar with how it's working. Okay, the next slide is on FEMA. And FEMA is being administered by Cal OES. So FEMA has, as you can imagine, a nationwide disaster. And this nationwide disaster required more bodies than FEMA can deploy. So they are doing, FEMA is going to be run by Cal OES in California. FEMA money covers 75% of eligible costs. And that's after all other costs have been applied, and you may not do double dipping. So they have different rules from the CARES Act money. And one thing I want to be sure that you're aware of is FEMA has a very rigorous audit. It's very rigorous compared to many of the audits we go through now, which are basically expenditure audits. This is a much more detailed audit, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I also gave you a link to a good page on that refers you to the Cal OES stuff. They also have good lists, and there are 4 more workshops for public agencies that they are going to be putting on if you want more information on that and you haven't attended one of those. It's a little bit death by PowerPoint, to be honest with you, but it's information you're going to have to wade through and know if you're going to apply for any FEMA money. As we know, the budgets are going to be very tight. I think any money you can bring to the table is going to be very valuable. Okay, Sam? The FEMA process, best I could glean it, me and a few other people as we look through it, you have to request do a request for public assistance. It's called an RPA. And then once you get approval of your RPA, you get a person that you're working with and that you can ask your questions. And then you go through managing your recovery through a damage inventory. All the costs that you incur have to be documented. And I cannot stress enough, they have to be well documented. And then within 60 days of the end of the event, you have to submit your streamlined app. And it's just important to know that because you're requesting assistance now, and there's no way you can know what your costs are going to be, they do allow you to keep adjusting that as you go. So there's no problem with going in now and getting that request for public assistance in. I would recommend you get in line now, get your request in, because there may be a time at which we say that they say, we're no longer in emergency, and they close the window, and you cannot get in and do an app even if you had allowable costs. So get on board, get your request in. You can cancel it later should you decide you don't want to do it. You can modify it as you go. They know that the costs change as they go through. So they do have a fairly flexible process that allows you to amend all the way up through your closeout application. Okay? And then a couple of things that I thought might help you manage. With the CARES Act money, it seems to be coming in just the way they did the 09 money. So that stimulus money that we got earlier, they're using the same very system. So you're going to get a resource code from the government. You're going to get your money dumped in the same way it came in during the recession. So you do need to have a unique identifier. Initially, we thought, well, maybe we'll use the year code like we do for some tagging other things, but don't do that, because federal money is what the year code was invented for, and they may want you to use the year code. You want to track it like a grant that has very heavy audit requirements. Okay, I cannot stress enough for you that FEMA is granular, and you in facilities that have been through FEMA audits need to help inform the rest of the district what a FEMA audit is like. They want not just, we ordered a box of N95 masks that we never would have ordered otherwise, or other PPE, and that is not sufficient. They will want to know, how was it distributed? Who got the masks? Why did they need them? How often did you distribute them? What's the personnel list? So you need your personnel list, you need your distribution records. So keep everything. And if you have a accounting system that you can upload documentation to, upload all the documentation you can. Just be sure it doesn't time out and go away, because the timeline may be shorter on that than your final audit with FEMA. So be really careful where you're storing things. Also, you want to think and strategize about how you're going to do your application for FEMA. So if you do the district as one big application, you cannot get that funding unless you have an expedited funding application, which they only really do for the really big projects. Otherwise, you have to finish the whole audit, every single bit of it, all of it, before you get any of the funding. And so it's much easier if it's broken up into, let's say, if you had one for every one of your sites, and then another one for elements that are district-wide. So be sure that you're thinking through, because that way, if you had a nice clean case for this school site, you could be done with that audit, get your money while you're still working on some of the other ones. So you want to think that through. Okay, Sam? So on strategy, you want to make sure you're using that CARES Act funding, that you're allocating that first, and then the remainder things go into that FEMA, which would be nice if they all covered the same things, but they don't. So you have to strategize it differently, right? They really don't cover the same things. For instance, all of your expenses for distance learning, for retraining your teachers to work remotely, for all of the devices that went home, none of that is covered by FEMA. You would have to put that stuff in the CARES Act money. So those are really important things. If you have employees, let's say you had a part-time person, a bus driver maybe, that you had now come back on the sterilization crew and help sterilize or clean classrooms, You do not want to do that ever under a stipend if you're going to get FEMA money for it. That cleaning does qualify under FEMA, but if you designate that person coming back as a full-time person hired, working out of class, so rehired as a disaster relief worker, then they're fully covered 100%, and you don't even have to offset the salary they would have otherwise received. So those kinds of nuances are why I gave you the websites. You need to read through. We in facilities understand that the better you understand a grant and the better you understand the application and funding process, along with how you keep the money at the end during audit, the more of that you understand, the better off you are in trying to maximize the amount of money that you'll receive in your district and that you'll be able to hang on to. So refer to those websites, begin to put together a plan. This is all fast developing. I don't have a lot more info I can share with you. So just want to be sure that you had these things. Get in line, get your FEMA apps in now, and be sure you're tracking everything with unique coding so that you can pull it up and justify it at the end. And they will be looking for that coding. And I didn't look at, had no questions, so either they've all given up or.
Letty, you were, this is Tom Duffy. You were thorough, and I don't think anybody needed to ask any questions. Thank you for doing that so quickly and giving us really what I think are fundamental concepts of preparing for federal funding, and in particular for FEMA. And we want to come back to FEMA as a topic, a larger topic in a future webinar. And we'd like to invite you to come back so you have more time with us, Letty. We really appreciate you being with us today.
And I'll know more by then, Tom. So we're all learning.
Well, again, thank you.
All right, well, that's great. Well, thank you all. Special thanks to Jeff, Jose, Tom, Ian, Dave, Bob. Oh, and let me start my video. Rex and Letty, thank you all so much. Wonderful information. And I want to say a big thanks to Samantha Campbell. She's our Zoom whiz behind the scenes, and you may see her name and stuff, but we never seem to see Sam. So a big thanks, Sam. She makes all this happen. So first, let's go ahead and say tune in tomorrow at 10 a.m. for part 2 of the state agency support and local challenges during the pandemic. We'll have updates from DSA and CDE. We'll discuss long-term issues stemming the COVID-19 and a look at local challenges ahead to open schools. And then as you see on the next slide, please, on the screen, is you'll see next Thursday, we have our part 2 of today, which is the maintenance operation, sanitizing, disinfecting, and know the differences of those two, healthy air and constant monitoring. So that's next Thursday. I just want to say Cash, myself, and all the presenters on the webinar today extend our best wishes for continued good health to you and your family. Again, gratitude and thanks to our essential workers and frontline heroes out there. Please follow your recommended county healthcare directives for your area. Cash will continue to keep you informed through emails and webinars on the COVID-19 as our world continues to evolve literally daily. And as we leave today, remember most of all, Cash, our Cash organization is here to be a help and resource to all of you. So thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow. If not, next Thursday. Stay Cash strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.